investigation they're under at the moment?
Yeah, so the Manchester City case is a total number of 115 allegations that the Premier League have put against Manchester City. A lot of those do link to the profit and sustainability regulations, but there are other things there that are in the mix as well. And this is a kind of, if you contrast that with Everton's case, it's a much more longer term list of allegations, if you like. So it stretches back to the last 10 years of profit and sustainability regulations in its entirety. We haven't seen a lot more in terms of a concrete update on that since the initial kind of deliverance of those allegations around the summertime. There was a lot of narrative in the early stages, and then we haven't seen much certainly in the mainstream media. So that case is still playing out, and there will be a verdict on that case at some point. I think obviously the natural comparisons then, as we're saying, because you've got the Everton situation and you've had a sanction that's been applied now by an independent commission through the Premier League, investigating Everton and putting that in front of the commission. Naturally, now people will talk about, well, if there's a case pending against Manchester City, what is the next phase of that link to the Everton case? And that's where we're kind of getting into the benchmarking conversations in the media. But they are two very different cases, and it will be interesting to see how the Premier League and any independent commission approach the Manchester City case versus the Everton case, because the two are not like for like in direct comparison.
I think maybe see some movement on what's happening with City at all.
Yeah, the first question is easier to answer than the second one there. So yes, it's because of the volume of allegations in that mix. There are a lot of cases to consider. There's a lot of detail within that, and it was always going to take time. I don't think anyone was under any illusions that one wasn't going to be a quick verdict. In terms of when we get some movement on that, again, it's very unclear at the minute in terms of where the end point to that is. But I do think there's an interesting subplot there as well in comparing the two cases, and your mention of the word, real time there, and the quickness of perhaps the Everton decision. Of course, that's been one of the cruxes of the profit and sustainability regulations, and any sanctions that you deploy off the back of those. A lot of people, and myself included, have always stated that those punishments should be dealt with in real time, and the Everton one probably could have been applied a couple of years ago, and has dragged a little bit. So I think anything moving forward, again, looking at how the Premier League set this all out over the next few years, whatever independent regulation becomes or not, it's really important that if we're going to start to put these sanctions in place, that the real-time aspect of that becomes critical, because that might hurt in the short term, but it can save a lot of chaos in the long term, because now you're in a situation with Everton where you've got potentially clubs claiming against that for years gone by. So within that, the City case and the City case and the Everton case, that real-time aspect of reporting becomes really important, and the City one is obviously linked to a bigger time period, which is why it's taking so long as well.
Really interesting. Relegation.
I mean, I think in terms of possibility, the answer is yes. I think there is a possibility of all of those things, but all of those things were on the table before the Everton verdict as well. So that is in the Premier League's governance frameworks. It's within their remit. They set the regulations. They monitor clubs against those regulations, and they deploy the sanctions. And the sanctions range from financial penalties in terms of fines to sporting penalties in terms of deductions or relegation or stripping of titles. So all of those things are kind of within the arc of what the Premier League can do. The biggest question is whether they will do. And I think that is the one that will be, the crux of some of this as well, is the implications of doing that, for an example. And again, people will debate the rights or wrongs of that, and the sanction, and having the breaches and then having a clear punishment. But it's always been, as we're talking about with the Everton case, there hasn't been any sanction to talk about yet. So we're looking for benchmarks and we're looking for precedent. So I don't think anything is fully off the table, but it's how that case plays out. It's how the mitigating circumstances play out. It's how Manchester City then react to that and put their defence forward that will determine the overall verdict. But it is very much within the Premier League and the independent commission's power, if you like, in that regard. If you look at who's holding the power there to deliver those sanctions, the question we don't know yet is what sanctions they will deliver.
going to be interesting to see trouble with the Premier League as well moving forward.
I think there's obviously the separate case with Chelsea at the minute around the past ownership and some of the things that are being looked into there in terms of potentially where some of those payments went, which is in play at the minute, which is again different to the spending spree we're talking about. I think the thing that Chelsea did in some regards to protect themselves from that particular issue with profit and sustainability regs is the long contracts that were delivered to those players. So yes, there were some on high fees, but there were also long contracts, which you have to divide the transfer fee by the contract length in terms of number of years, and that's the charge per year for FFP. So there is some, they were doing that in a way where you could see that they were mindful of the regulations moving forward, and of course they've managed to sell a few players in accounting terms for pure profit that have come through the youth system. So there is a bit of a counterbalance that we probably need to look at with Chelsea spending. Despite the nature of the transfer fees out, there's some other things in the mix that the club were considering. I get the sense that they should be looking at having their house in order in that regard in the future with this sort of stuff, but that doesn't mean that they're fully off the radar. And of course, over the top of that, we've got UEFA's regulations that if they want to get back into the Champions League, they have to conform to as well. So they will need to be mindful of both the Premier League and UEFA's regulations moving forward.
And just a very quick line on, you just explain that to our viewers as well.
Yeah, so again, the details of this are kind of, we're not privy to the full picture in terms of from the outside looking in, but there's some allegations here that some payments have gone to other organisations and in some cases other football clubs from the previous owner of Chelsea when they were under the control of Roman Abramovich, and that's what this particular kind of angle of that case is looking into in terms of why those payments were delivered and who they were delivered to and for what reason. Again, we don't know the full details of that, but that's a kind of separate case in that regard in terms of something a little bit different, because that payment's from one club, Chelsea, linked to the ownership structure from a time gone by, to other clubs and other connected parties.
Fantastic. What they impose.
I think I don't think the European Super League will ever go away, and I think we've seen that time and time again. It was probably the closest it's ever been to fruition in 2021, but we know the backlash there. But it's never off the table, and you've seen the kind of narrative wider in the European football landscape, the group that's now been formed to take that on, and my take on it was that it would always come back around, particularly dependent on what the Champions League looks like and the Champions League broadcasting revenues and the reformat of that competition moving forward. So broadly speaking, I don't think it's off the table. And I think the Premier League, if we look at that through an English lens, will also be mindful of that, because they know that there is a lot of power held by those big clubs and their ownership structures and the people that are in the mix. And they know that threat of a Super League is still there. And I do think that will be a kind of factor in this, whether we like it or not. It will be kind of there in the background of the considerations. And there is that argument, of course, much is the same with UEFA and the Champions League, that if the bigger clubs, don't get what they want or feel that they're being, too heavily penalised, then you can probably, bet that a conversation about a European Super League will come back around. I think it would have probably come around anyway, but this kind of stuff might accelerate that. If you get that kind of direction there, it might make it move quicker or come around quicker again. But I don't think it was ever off the table.
I hope you're wrong, but I think